Hi everyone. My name is Sadie Troy. I'm the Student Learning Specialist at Mount Vernon, and I'm here with my colleague.
I'm Dana Stefanelli. I'm the editor of the Papers of George Washington here at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon.
And we are very excited to talk to you all today. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Good. Oh, good. We can hear you. That's awesome. And where are you guys?
Kansas.
We're in Kansas.
Awesome. Awesome. And Good Shepherd, if you guys use the chat, feel free to chat to us and tell us where you are. Do you guys know where Mount Vernon is?
Yes.
Where's Mount Vernon?
Virginia.
Excellent. Yeah. And what is Mount Vernon? Do you guys know?
George Washington.
Excellent. Yeah. So we are calling you guys from the home of George and Martha Washington in Northern Virginia, right outside Alexandria, Virginia. So here, let me see if I can pull up my PowerPoint, show you guys some information about it. Oops. Hold on, I'm going to get this. Oops, wait, hold on. There you go. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Because what we want to talk about, Mount Vernon, but more importantly today we want to talk about George Washington, the Potomac River, and then how he helped start Washington, D.C. And hey, it looks like we had more kids join us.
Yes.
Hi, Stuart Manor. Hi, where are you guys calling us from?
Long Island, New York.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. Well, we were just explaining that we're calling from Mount Vernon in Washington, D.C. You may know what it looks like. These here are two different images of the house. These are original paintings. I'll let Dana describe these.
Sure. These are 18th century paintings of Washington's house, Mount Vernon. The one on the left is probably the image of Mount Vernon that is most familiar to people. It includes what we might call the driveway today, the circular path where people arrive by foot or by horse or carriage. But the painting on the right is of the east front of Mount Vernon, the side of the house, the mansion that faces the Potomac River. And this is actually, in George Washington's time, this would have been considered the front of the house, the view of the house that most people saw, because most people would have seen the house as they traveled up and down the Potomac River. So it has sort of a more impressive entryway, you might say, than the west front. You can see here these big columns, the east portico, which was designed to look grand, to look really fancy for the people who saw the estate from the river.
Yeah, and the Potomac River is going to be a big theme for our talk today. It was very important to Washington. He grew up on the river, and it's an essential part of kind of his entire life. And we're especially not only his private life of just growing up on the river, but then his political life as well. Rivers were extremely important. And this one here, we have a nice quote that Washington made about the Potomac and actually about Mount Vernon. It's one of our favorites. He said, "No estate in United America is more pleasantly situated than this. It lies in a high and dry, healthy country, 300 miles by water from the sea. And as you will see by the plan, on one of the finest rivers in the world." And rivers, kind of in general, are something we want to highlight today and talk with you guys because they were extremely important in the 1700s during Washington's life. And we thought we'd start out talking with you guys. Can any of you think of any reasons why the rivers were so important in Washington's time? If any students want to come up to the camera and let us know, Good Shepherd, share on that chat if you know, but what do you think in Kansas? Oops, we just got muted. Hold on, let's unmute that and then, here we go.
For water to drink and to feed, to give to animals.
Absolutely, water is essential for not just us to drink, but everyone to drink. That's a really important reason, or for rivers. Do you have another one?
Travel.
Travel. That's really important. Yeah, rivers were some of the first highways in this country. It's the first way that people got around. Absolutely. Stuart Manor, do you guys have any ideas as to why rivers were so important? Anyone want to come up and share? Oops, I don't think we can hear you. Is the volume of the mic up? If not, we can type in the chat.
And to grind, make energy and grind wheat.
Oh, that's exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely. To grind wheat, to make energy, you can use water in different like mill type of situations, and for technology, absolutely.
And Stuart Manor typed in the chat for trade.
Oh, trade, absolutely. That's a great one. Trade is really, that is something we're going to definitely touch on. Being able to spread that commerce, have farmers send their goods to market to trade on the waters, going to different cities, you know, textiles going north and goods coming south. Absolutely. Does anyone have other suggestions? You're welcome to use the chat or the video function. Because I think you guys really kind of hit on most of the ones that Dana and I were going to talk about. We just put up a couple of these, but you guys added great ones with the food, the water, the mechanics. That's great, but as you mentioned, travel, trade, and then we put in security and bringing people together, or the union. Because if you look at this map, waters a lot of times would form borders that can separate different territories, different land, different countries. They're nice barriers between people. Ships and soldiers can cross, and you know, what was that famous river Washington crossed during the Revolutionary War?
Delaware.
Great job. Yeah. So, you know, there's definitely security. And then the union, kind of in how you guys had the idea of food, travel, and trade, it brings people together. Rivers help make those connections of people to become closer when they're further away, spread their ideas, their communications, and their goods and services. So it's a way to help identify and bring people together. Absolutely. And so this is going to be a growing theme that we have throughout, and it's something in this talk, and it's something that people kept in mind a lot in Washington's time, not just for trade and travel of personal goods, but also for the good of the country as well. Because when you think about America, think about those early cities. Many of them were founded on rivers and waters. Places like New York City or Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, all these large cities that become kind of economic hubs are on the water to make that travel so easy. And as our country was newly developing, and the government started looking for a new national capital, the river is where they turned. And I'm gonna let Dana talk about that, but the search for the new capital was definitely invested heavily in waters.
Yeah, to a lot of people, the big question for where to put a capital city for the United States was which river should the capital city be located on. And one important consideration that people had in mind, Americans had in mind, was that it should be centrally located, somewhere in the middle of the United States, so that the capital would be easy for as many Americans to reach as possibly could. So it would be easy for representatives in the federal government to get to the seat of government, the capital, but also for visitors of all kinds, for everyday Americans who have to petition the government or had cases in the federal courts, the Supreme Court especially, that they should be able to reach the national capital if they needed to. So some of the major rivers that were under consideration for the capital city they included the Hudson River in New York. You can see it reaching all the way north up into the upper Hudson Valley near Canada, and then down here where it empties into the ocean near New York City. The Delaware River, right, as we mentioned, another long, important river by which people traveled and traded goods. Then the Susquehanna River, which also flows or comes from deep within the continent and empties into the Chesapeake Bay at the north end of the Chesapeake Bay, sort of around where Wilmington, Delaware is now. And then there's the Potomac River, like we've been talking about, which also empties into the Chesapeake Bay, but its headwaters, the place where it starts, is way, way, way west in the Western Territory in the Ohio country. And George Washington in particular thought it was really important, a really important river because it stretched west and had the potential for bringing people from the Western United States to the Eastern United States and being a central place where Americans could easily come together and meet for whatever reasons they might need to meet.
And so, yeah, so as the new government is trying to decide, Washington is definitely advocating for the Potomac as a location for the new capital, to put it on that river. And there are kind of three major reasons. You guys touched on some of these reasons as to why, but as Dana just said, one of the big things was Washington wanted to use the river for trade, to connect the new nation's capital to all the markets out west. Because the biggest thing he saw as the Potomac is that it was an east to west river. So he wasn't just concerned about north and south traveling, but east and west, because of how many farmers were starting to go way west, cross the Appalachian Mountains, and start making land farms in the Ohio Territory and other regions. And it was hard for them to bring their goods to our economy, to our markets. Because do you guys think it's easy to climb mountains with your grain and your horses? Right? No, it's definitely not. So the rivers are going to make that travel easy, and it's going to connect those farmers in ways that weren't established just yet. So that's one of the things he's advocating, because the Potomac River has this great connection. It goes over the mountains and then it connects to the Ohio River, which flows even further west than the Potomac. So think about all those people in his mind that could connect with that city. Trade was a big one. Another idea that he was pushing for the Potomac was kind of the idea of security for the country.
So, the security consideration was a big one for Washington, who helped win independence for the United States during the Revolution. But the fact that a lot of the European empires that colonized North America, like Spain over here, still controlled territory on the continent. And Britain, this is British Canada up here. So both the British and the Spanish still had imperial territories in North America. And so Washington and a lot of other lawmakers had to be concerned, they were concerned, that they might become involved in another European war, and that some of these empires might try and claim or reclaim territory that was the United States. either by conquest or by convincing Americans, people in the United States, to come over to their side. And so that was also, that was part of his concerns about political union and security. And he believed that a good system of transportation using the rivers as best as possible could combat that.
Yeah, it's a way to bring people together. As we mentioned, all their trades, not just through money or their economy, but kind of giving them an identity, making sure that the Western farmers had the connection to the Eastern markets and the Eastern people so that they still felt a part of that American identity. Because these rivers, they also could have had the option to send goods down the Mississippi River and trade with the Spanish in Louisiana, or go up the Mississippi and trade with the British in Canada. And if these farmers are selling goods, passing back communication, passing back information with the other countries more so than they are with their American people, maybe that unity, that strong bond that they just won in the Revolutionary War was not going to last as long. So by unifying the country and through the different routes of rivers and easy transport, Washington was really hoping the Potomac could be a nice connector for everyone. And then all of that lead into the federal city.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning here that the rivers by themselves weren't necessarily 100% useful for transporting goods and people. And that was part of why Washington promoted the Potomac, was because they had to clear the river, keep the river clear. Sometimes they had to connect different rivers together using canals or other transportation devices, roads, or sometimes railroads. So one thing that was a concern was that the Mississippi River was a big river, and it was a lot easier for people to get on and off and to use the Mississippi to travel down to New Orleans, which was part of the Spanish Empire. So one reason that Washington and others promoted rivers so much was because they also believed that Americans needed to make an effort to develop them and improve them so that they could be used and they would be a better option than some of the other options like the Mississippi that could cause problems for the American Union down the road.
And as you can see by all these maps we're showing, the Potomac, right, it's not the only river in the country. There are a lot of these rivers that are connecting people, connecting trade and travel. So there are a lot of different rivers that, as Dana mentioned, like the Hudson and the Delaware, that people are advocating for to put the nation's capital on, because there are so many. This, especially the Eastern Seaboard has a ton of rivers. And we're just talking about what Washington is advocating for the Potomac. So this fight in the Congress kind of goes on for a few years of people going back and forth and where they should put the capital. And they're not really sure until a compromise happens in the year 1790. Just by a show of hands, do we have any Hamilton fans in the rooms? Any Hamilton musical fans in there? We got a few, it looks like. Awesome. Well, in 1790, do you guys, the compromise where Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison came together, does anybody know what song that is in the musical? You want to type it out or shout it out in the chat?
Okay.
I forgot the song.
Stuart Manor, you guys have an idea of what song the compromise is?
No.
Where they come together and decide where the nation's capital should be placed? So it's the room where it happens. So, please.
And so, you know, they, Hamilton and Madison meet for dinner at Thomas Jefferson's house in New York. and they agree to compromise where Hamilton gets the financial plan that he wants for the United States, or part of it, and in exchange, the Madison and Jefferson and the advocates for the Potomac, which includes George Washington, get the capital placed on the banks of the Potomac. And so that part of the deal, of the compromise, where the Potomac becomes the river where the capital will be built, is enacted into law in the Residence Act of 1790.
Yeah, so you guys are looking at that legal document that took that great Hamilton song and made it a law with through, as Dana just said, the Residence Act of 1790. So Congress came together and agreed that the Capitol was going to be built on the Potomac River, but this act is even more important because of for us, because of the powers that it gave President George Washington at the time. So he was able to do three major things because of this act that helped influence what Washington, D.C. becomes today. The first is he got to choose the exact location on the Potomac where it would be decided. Washington grew up as a surveyor. He knows how to understand the land, how to read maps and draw maps and find locations. And so the Potomac, with it being that kind of long river, Washington has a big area where he can choose what to do. So he chooses, so he has the power to choose the location. The second power is he gets to hire a 3-person commission to oversee the project. And the third is he gets to hire the building architect or city planner. So these are all really big decisions that are super important in this new capital city that's going to be happening. And so the first thing he does after this act is passed is he chose the location, right on the exact location on the Potomac.
So the U.S. Constitution says that Congress could establish a federal district not to exceed 10 miles square, so 100 square miles, and Washington having the authority to decide exactly where the federal buildings would be on the north bank of the Potomac. He picked this area where the Potomac River and the Anacostia River, what they called the eastern branch of the Potomac in Washington's day, he decided to put the federal buildings here where the two rivers met. And around that area, he decided the boundaries of the federal district. So each one of these sides of the federal district is 10 miles long, and it includes Alexandria, the town in Northern Virginia, and Georgetown, the town in south central Maryland, were included in the district. George Washington hoped that by including people in the city that would help it grow. And so these are the original boundaries of what we call today Washington, D.C. Later on, the part that belongs to Virginia goes back to Virginia. But at this time, it was, according to Washington's boundaries, it was the full 100 square miles for the federal district. Now, it was in this area, as I mentioned, that the public buildings, the federal buildings, would be built. And to lay out that part of the city, Washington hired Peter Charles L'Enfant, who you may have heard called Pierre L'Enfant, and that was the name he was born with. He was French, and he came over to America to fight in the American Revolution. But when he came over to America, he decided that he was an American and that he would change his name to Peter and use the name Peter, and that's what he did for the rest of his life. But this is the famous plan of Washington City that L'Enfant designed, where he would place the federal buildings and where the streets and roads of Washington City would go. And it's kind of hard to read, and so better copies, a better version of the plan was made and printed for everyday people to use. And this is probably, if you've ever seen the plan of Washington City, what we call Washington, D.C., this is the plan that you probably know best. It's been called the most famous city plan in America, and that's probably true.
But yeah, as you can, and so this is the later design, but it just highlight as Dana talked about earlier, it has all these rivers and the Potomac right here to connect it, because Washington, as he said, was hoping by having Georgetown and Alexandria, by having that would help this city grow. That it wasn't just enough to have the government buildings there, but by including the rivers, it would make it accessible for everyone, for travelers to visit, for people to come and live, but to build the economy so that it was more than just the government city, but an actual economic center that the Potomac would flow and bring people to and from, and goods would disperse throughout the country from this area.
He also hoped, and one of the reasons he hired L'Enfant was because he had a lot of respect for L'Enfant's work as an architect, and so he wanted it to be a beautiful city, an attractive city, a place people would want to come and visit and live and buy land and build houses and start businesses and invest their money. So this sort of grand city plan was really important in Washington's mind, because he wanted the city to be a success, because if the city was a success, then the Potomac River as a transportation conduit would also be a success.
And so this whole development, all these choices are going on during Washington's presidency, even though he's not there. Since this city is being developed, Washington's first inauguration was in New York City. So he starts his presidency in New York City, close to our friends in Long Island. And then his second inauguration takes place in Philadelphia. So those are the two cities he spent his presidency, but throughout it, he was keeping a very careful eye on the buildings that were going up, keeping in contact with L'Enfant and for his management, and then also with those three commissioners who are overseeing the project. He also oversees this project into his retirement. We have a picture here. It's one of our prized ones in our collection. And this is Washington in retirement post-presidency. You can see him and his wife Martha here at the table, and then their two grandchildren. There's an enslaved butler behind them. And here on the table is a map for the plans of the capital city. So even after he was president and John Adams had taken over, Washington was still involved. He was still writing with commissioners. He bought plots of land in the capital city to try and encourage others to build and come join the city. So it definitely was an important piece of the country that was very close to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that, you know, in this painting, the artist, Edward Savage, who also painted those pictures of Mount Vernon that we saw at the beginning, he really captured, or was trying to capture, the legacy that George Washington wanted to leave behind for his fellow Americans, for the people, for the generations that came after him. You can see, in addition to the plan of Washington City here on the table, you can see a little bit of the Potomac River in the background. And so for George Washington, he thought these were really critical parts of the work that he did as president and the legacy that he was leaving the country, a permanent national capital where Americans could gather, come together and discuss and debate the important issues of the day, and a river by which they could arrive and travel, and a whole transportation system connected to that, where Americans in the American Union could become more unified, more integrated, to get to know everyone, each other better, and to eventually to think of themselves as Americans and not just people from different states and different places.
So that's all we have on our PowerPoint, but we wanted to open it up and see if you guys had questions about anything of Washington's presidency or about George Washington and Mount Vernon, things that you want to know that you're curious about. Yeah. Let's see. Stuart Manor, is that, yeah. Do you have a question? Come on up to the, oh.
Did anyone run against George Washington when he ran for president?
Oh, that's a great question. Did anyone run against George Washington?
No, he did not have competition, though it's a little bit strange in the sense that in the original, according to the original Constitution, you voted for president and vice president at the same time, and the person who got the second most votes became the vice president. So technically there were other candidates, but George Washington was the one who was trying to be president and the one that everybody voted for president.
Yeah, that's really important that Dan said. The one that everyone voted for. Washington's the only president in our history that won all the votes, that every person who could vote voted for him. So he did that twice, unanimously elected twice.
By the Electoral College.
Did he want to be president?
Ooh, did he want to be president?
I think he very much wanted to serve his country, and he wanted the nation to be successful. And I think he wanted to be president, yes, though he was a little nervous about it. He wasn't sure that he would be good at the job. So yes, he wanted to be, but he was a little bit worried about how he would perform in office.
I bet. Yeah, no one had come before him. He really wasn't sure what was going to happen. Before we take your question, I just want to stress, Stuart Manor, you guys can type your questions in the chat and we'll get to them too as well. But go ahead from Kansas.
So how old was George Washington when he got out of president? See?
When he got in or out?
Out.
Out.
When he got out of the presidency, he was 63 years old when he left office.
63 years old. Go ahead, sir.
What was George Washington's retirement plans?
He wanted to focus on building Mount Vernon into a successful farm and business operation. And in addition to his farmland, he started a whiskey distillery and a grist mill during his time. So he was making whiskey and grinding grain and doing all kinds of different business pursuits.
Yeah, and I think that because that's something really important to point out. I know a lot of us know George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the army and the president, but he always considered himself a farmer first and foremost. I know that we're talking to you from Mount Vernon, and that was his home, but Mount Vernon was, by the time of Washington's death, an 8,000-acre plantation. It was home to free and enslaved people, and as Danny just said, full of industry. Washington, he grew tobacco and then switched to wheat farming. He had a grist mill, a distillery. So there was a lot of farming application going on here in his retirement and the years before.
That's true. We're muted. Okay, can you hear Stuart Manor now?
I can, we can.
Hear
Okay,
you.
great. So we have a couple of questions. Can we go
Oh,
ahead?
perfect.
Go ahead, Samir, loud.
Was George Washington okay with having slaves?
Wow.
He, as a young man, he was very comfortable with slavery. He did not really question whether or not it was right or wrong. But as he got older and he fought in the Revolution for people's freedom and became a lot more concerned about individual liberty and what individual liberty and freedom meant, he came to have a lot of reservations about slavery. And at some point in his later years, decided that slavery was wrong and that he would free his slaves when he died, which he did in his will.
Okay, Anna, do you have a question? Loudly.
Was George Washington successful with his trade?
With his trade?
Yes.
Yeah, George Washington was a successful business person, unusually in some ways successful, because being a Virginia planter could be really, was a really difficult business. Most Virginia farmers, planters grew tobacco, which was a very difficult crop to make a profit on. But George Washington recognized that tobacco had a lot of problems, and he experimented with new crops, and he switched most of his estates to growing wheat and other grains. And as we mentioned before, also some other businesses like the whiskey distilling, which we think he may have been, was likely the largest largest maker of whiskey in the United States when he died in 1799.
Michael, you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
How many slaves did George Washington own?
He owned about 200 in his own right. Also, through his wife's estate, the Custis estate, he owned or controlled the labor, had authority over about 150 more slaves.
And he freed all of them?
He could only free the ones that he owned in his own name. So the ones that he owned directly, he did free. But the Custis slaves, he had no authority over, and his Martha Washington's grandchildren inherited them.
Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah.
Ivana?
I want to know how long George Washington served as president.
He served as president 2 full terms, so 8 years.
Excellent. Did you have more questions in Kansas?
But they said
And we'll come back, Stuart. We'll come back to Stuart Manor in just a moment.
How old is Mount Vernon?
Oh, that's a good question.
That is
It's a hard one.
That's a good question. I think the first buildings here were built in the 1740s, though the plantation, the land itself was farmed for about 80 years before that. But the house that we know as Mount Vernon, the original part of it was built in the 1740s, and then it was expanded upon. George Washington made it bigger. It was a lot smaller, and he added to it, made it a lot bigger than it was originally.
Good question, though. You have another one? Go ahead.
When George Washington was serving for his second term, when he was being elected, did he run against somebody?
No, there were no one else elected to stand for president. So he was a unanimous choice.
Yep, and actually people wanted him to stay president. He was a little unsure if he was going to take a second term, but they were so invested in having him as president that many people convinced him to do it. So yeah, there was really no one to go for a kind of a opposition.
When did Washington get married?
So
What is the exact date?
so Washington was married, that's a good question. It was during the French and Indian War, correct?
1759, I think.
Yeah, 1759 is when he met Martha for the first time. And after a couple meetings, they were married on January 6th, 1759. So, and they were married for 40 years before he passed away in 1799. Good question. Do you have another one?
Did Washington's wife own slaves?
Yes, she did. Martha Washington, married a man named Daniel Custis. And Daniel Custis was one of the richest men in Virginia, in the Custis estate, which she inherited when Daniel Custis died. there were nearly 200 slaves that were part of the custom state.
Yeah, it can be a very confusing topic, because since she did not inherit the slaves, they went to her children. She was just kind of in charge of the care until her children could inherit, and it keeps getting passed down because it's from her husband's family, not hers.
She was entrusted with the slaves until her son was old enough to inherit.
This is Stuart Manor. I just want to say thank you very much. My students have to leave, but they really appreciated your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. You too. Okay.
Well, if the student, do you have more questions for us from Kansas?
We have 3 more.
Perfect.
Did Washington have kids?
Oh, that's a good one. Washington did not have any children of his own. However, he did have 2 stepchildren when he married his wife, Martha. She came into the marriage with 2 children. And then his stepson had 4 children. So Washington actually had 4 step-grandchildren, and 2 of them that he raised here at Mount Vernon. So while he didn't have any children of his own, he does have the step-kids and grandkids that lived with him here at Mount Vernon.
How many slaves did any of his slaves go to the British side?
Yes, about 15 enslaved workers escaped during the Revolution, and I don't think we know exactly what happened to them.
Yeah, not all the, yeah, so while Washington was off fighting in New York, I believe, a British ship came and docked at Mount Vernon on the river that we showed you. And the soldiers threatened to burn the house down unless Washington's nephew, right? Unless Washington's cousin, who was watching the house, supplied the British soldiers with supplies like food or other things that they would need. And his cousin gave in and sent the supplies to the British so that they wouldn't burn the house down. And during that time, there were some enslaved workers that ran away to the British ship because the British were advertising freedom for enslaved workers that would fight on their side.
I think that's all the questions we have.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys very much. Enjoy the rest of your day in Kansas. Come see us.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.